The mark had been burning for 3 days before Seraphine finally pressed the blade to her own skin. Not a ceremonial knife, not the jeweled dagger the healers used for ritual severance. A kitchen blade, stolen from the scullery while the servants slept, its edge dulled from years of cutting root vegetables and skinning rabbits. She heated it in the embers of her small hearth until the metal glowed the color of a dying sun. And then she pressed it to the place where his teeth had marked her. The junction of throat and shoulder, where Cale Voss, Alpha King of the Ironmore Pack, had sunk his claim into her flesh 6 months ago. She did not scream. The bond fought back. It always did. A sensation like fishhooks buried in her chest, pulling toward the east wing of the fortress, where he slept beside Verelda, the noble-born daughter of the Silver Fang Alpha, the woman he had taken to his bed 3 weeks after marking Seraphine as his fated mate. The bond shrieked through her blood, demanding she stop, demanding she crawl back to him, demanding she survive on the scraps of his attention like a dog beneath the table. Seraphine pressed harder. The skin hissed. The mark, 2 crescent punctures surrounded by a silver bruise that had never faded, blistered, blackened, and began to disappear. The pain was extraordinary. It reached behind her eyes, into the base of her skull, down through her spine, and into her legs, until her knees buckled and she hit the stone floor. But she kept the blade in place, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was another morning watching him look through her as if she were glass. Another evening hearing Verelda's laughter echoing from the high chambers. Another year of being the inconvenient mistake, the Omega whose blood had inexplicably called to the most powerful wolf in 6 territories, only for him to decide that power and politics mattered more than fate. When she pulled the blade away, the mark was gone. In its place, a burn scar, ragged and deliberate, shaped like nothing, shaped like refusal. She dressed it with a strip torn from her bedsheet. She packed nothing. There was nothing to pack. 6 months as the unacknowledged mate of the Alpha King had given her a room smaller than the kennels, 2 dresses that had belonged to a dead servant, and a reputation as the greatest embarrassment in Ironmore's history. She left it all. The eastern gate was unguarded at the 4th bell. She knew this because she had spent 5 weeks learning the rotation of the sentries, mapping the gaps, memorizing the interval between patrols with the same patient precision that had kept her alive through 18 years as the lowest Omega in the Ashenmere Pack. Survival was a skill. She had always been gifted. The Thornwood began where the fortress grounds ended, a wall of ancient black pine and knotted oak that no wolf entered willingly. The old stories said the forest was alive, that it remembered, that the last wolf who had walked beneath its canopy uninvited had emerged 7 years later, white-haired and speaking a language no one recognized. The Thornwood was not a forest. It was a judgment. Seraphine walked into it without looking back. The trees swallowed her whole. Cale felt the severance at dawn. He was standing in the war chamber, reviewing territorial maps with his beater, Drustan, when something inside his chest simply stopped. Not his heart. Something deeper. Something that had been humming beneath his ribs for 6 months like a second pulse. A warmth he had refused to name, but had grown so accustomed to that its sudden absence was like the floor dropping from beneath him. His hand went to his chest. His claws extended without his permission, puncturing the leather of his tunic. "My king?" Drustan's voice, careful. The beater had learned to read the dangerous stillness that preceded Cale's worst moments. The moments when the curse pressed closest, when the cold that had lived inside him for 300 years threatened to crack through the surface and turn the room to frost. Something is wrong. Cale's voice came out scraped raw. The bond. The bond he had tried to bury, to starve, to pretend was a malfunction of his wolf rather than the truest thing he had ever felt. It was gone. Not muted, not distant. Gone. As if someone had reached into his chest and ripped out a thread he hadn't realized was holding him together. He was moving before he understood where. Down the corridor, past the great hall where servants were laying the morning fires, through the narrow passage that led to the East Tower, and then he was standing in front of her door. The door he had not allowed himself to open in 3 months, because every time he came close, his wolf howled so loudly that the guards could hear it in his throat. The room was empty. The bed was stripped to its bare straw mattress. The hearth held cold ashes and the remnants of something burned. Cloth, perhaps, or bandaging. On the floor beside the fireplace, a kitchen blade with a blackened edge. Cale picked it up, smelled it. Iron. Ash. And beneath both, her blood. Her blood and the unmistakable scent of cauterized flesh. She had burned his mark off her body. For 300 years, the curse of Ironmore had made Cale Voss incapable of feeling warmth. Not metaphorically. The curse was literal, laid by a dying witch whose daughter Cale's grandfather had rejected. A bloodline punishment that passed from alpha to alpha, freezing them from the inside. Cale's skin ran cold to the touch. Fires did not warm him. Furs could not help. In 3 centuries, nothing had penetrated the frost that lived inside his bones. But when the bond had snapped into place 6 months ago, when he had looked across the great hall during the Ashenmere tribute and seen a bruised, thin-armed Omega woman staring back at him with eyes that held no fear, only a vast and weary patience. For the first time in 300 years, something in his chest had flickered. Warm. Alive. Terrifying. And he had done the one thing his wolf would never forgive. He had turned away from her. Not because he wanted to, because Varelda's father controlled the mountain passes, and without the Silverfang alliance, the Ironmore would face war on 2 fronts. Because the council had spent months negotiating the match, and an Omega Luna, a battered, nameless Omega from a vassal pack, would shatter every alliance he had built. Because he told himself the bond was a complication he could manage, that she would accept her place, that the warmth in his chest was a trick of the curse, not its cure. He had been wrong about everything. Find her. His voice filled the room like a physical force, the walls vibrating with the resonance of an alpha command that could buckle the knees of any wolf within earshot. Every scout, every tracker, every wolf in this fortress. Find her. Now. Drustan appeared in the doorway, already pale. My king. The Eastern Gate sentries report. The Thornwood. Her centrail leads into the Thornwood. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Cale had ever heard. No one entered the Thornwood and returned unchanged. Most did not return at all. 3 days passed. The scouts Cale sent to the forest's edge came back shaking, unable to cross the tree line. Something in the wood refused them. A pressure. An ancient will that pressed against their wolves and turned them around like children redirected by a firm hand. Cale went himself on the 2nd day, stood at the boundary with his claws buried in the bark of a tree older than his curse, his wolf throwing itself against the invisible barrier with a fury that cracked his human composure until his eyes blazed gold and frost crawled up his arms, and his beta had to physically pull him back before the cold consumed him entirely. The Thornwood chooses, said Maren, the ancient healer who had served 3 generations of Ironmore Alphas. She sat by the fire in Cale's chambers, unbothered by his pacing, unintimidated by the ice that crept along the floor wherever he stood too long. "You cannot command a forest that predates your bloodline, boy. She will die in there." Perhaps. Maren's voice was dry as old paper. Or perhaps the forest recognized something in her that you were too blind to see. Cale turned on her with a snarl that rattled the windows. Maren did not flinch. She had changed his swaddling clothes. She had set the bones he broke in training. She had held his mother's hand as the curse took her warmth on the day she became Luna. And she had watched Cale's father freeze to death from the inside on the throne. And she had watched Cale repeat every mistake because power made men stupid and curses made them cruel. "You marked her, and then you humiliated her," Maren said. "You let Verelda take the chambers that should have been hers. You let the court call her the king's error to her face. You forbade your own wolf from going to her because you were afraid, not of politics, not of war, but of the fact that she made you feel something, and feeling something terrified you more than any enemy ever could. Enough. She burned your mark off with a kitchen knife, Cale. That is not the act of a woman who left on impulse. That is the act of a woman who decided, methodically and with absolute clarity, that she would rather face the Thornwood than spend another day being invisible to you." The frost climbed the walls. The fire in the hearth guttered and nearly died. If you're listening, and this story has its hooks in you, tap that like button so I know to keep bringing stories like this one. On the 4th morning, Verelda arrived at his chambers uninvited. She was beautiful, silver-haired, sharp-featured, draped in white fur that set off the pale perfection of her skin. She moved through the court like a blade, and the court adored her for it. She was everything an Alphas Luna should be: noble, powerful, strategic. She was also the reason his curse was getting worse. "The Omega is gone," Verelda said, settling into the chair by his fire as though she belonged there. "The pack is relieved. Now we can proceed with the bonding ceremony, without this embarrassment hovering in the background." Cale looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time he noticed the thing that Maren had been trying to tell him for months. The thin smile that never quite reached Verelda's eyes when she spoke of Seraphine. Not jealousy. Something colder. Satisfaction. "You knew she would run," he said quietly. Verelda's smile did not waver. "I knew she would break. They always do, the low-born ones. They are not built for stone halls and wolf politics." "What did you do?" "I did nothing. I simply ensured she understood her position. A word here, a closed door there. The servants knew not to bring her meals unless she asked, and she was too proud to ask. The seamstress lost her measurements. Twice. Her invitation to the winter court was misplaced." Verelda examined her nails. "She was miserable, Cale. I simply gave misery permission to do what it does." The temperature in the room plummeted so sharply that Verelda's breath turned to mist. The frost on the walls thickened into ice. The fire died completely. Cale's eyes were no longer gold. They were white, the color of a blizzard, the color of the curse at its most lethal, the color that the old wolves said had not been seen since his grandfather's reign. His voice came from somewhere beneath language, somewhere primal and enormous, and barely contained in a human throat. "Get out of my fortress. Cale, you are banished from Ironmore territory. if you are found within my borders after nightfall, I will consider it a declaration of war against the Silver Fang. Take your attendants. Take your furs. Take every trace of your presence and leave, before I forget that killing you would start a conflict I do not have time for. Ferelda stood. For the first time, fear fractured the perfection of her composure. You would risk the alliance? For an Omega? For a woman who does not even want you? She removed your mark, Kael. She rejected you. No. His voice cracked on the word. Not with rage, but with something far more devastating. Recognition. She survived me. There is a difference. Ferelda left within the hour. The Silver Fang alliance shattered before sunset. On the 7th day, the Thornwood opened. Kael was on the battlements when it happened. He had taken to standing there at dawn and dusk, staring at the tree line with the fixed intensity of a wolf watching the horizon for something it has lost. The frost that trailed him everywhere had worsened. His hands had begun to lose sensation. Maren said the curse was accelerating, that the bond's severance had removed the only thing slowing it, and, if it continued, he would be ice within the month, frozen on his throne like his father, like his grandfather, like every Ironmoor alpha who had been too proud or too afraid to let the warmth in. He did not care. He deserved it. The trees moved first, the outermost pines leaning apart like sentries stepping aside, their branches pulling back to create an avenue of open ground that had not existed before. Then the light changed. The perpetual grey that hung over the Thornwood shifted, and something golden, actual physical warmth, poured through the gap in the canopy like liquid. She walked out of the forest, and she was not the same woman. The bruises were gone. The thinness, the careful way she had held herself as if expecting a blow, gone. Seraphine moved with a fluidity that was not entirely human, her bare feet silent on the frost-hardened ground, her dark hair unbound and threaded with something that caught the light. Silver or starlight, or something older. Her eyes, which had been brown, were now the deep amber of old forest sap. And on her skin, her arms, her collarbones, the line of her throat, markings moved. Not tattoos, not scars. Living patterns that shifted like branches in wind, like roots seeking water, like the forest itself had written its name on her body and claimed her as its own. She carried no weapon. She needed none. The Thornwood moved with her, the branches overhead shifting to follow her path, the ground softening beneath her feet. Birds that had not been seen this close to the fortress in living memory settled in the trees behind her, as if forming a court. The wolves on the battlements dropped to their knees, not because they were commanded, because something ancient in their blood recognized what she was, what the Thornwood had made her, or perhaps what it had simply revealed. Kael descended the stairs so fast he nearly fell. He came through the gate at a dead run and then stopped, 10 paces from her, because she looked at him, and he could not breathe, could not move. His wolf was utterly silent for the first time in his life, not straining or howling or fighting, but simply still, the way a creature goes still in the presence of something sacred. The burn scar on her neck was gone. In its place, a mark he did not recognize. Not his bite, not any alpha's claim. Something older. A circle of interlocking branches, a crown of thorns that had bloomed. Seraphine. Her name in his mouth like a prayer he had forgotten the words to. The forest showed me what I am, she said. Her voice was the same, steady, direct, unhurried. The voice of a woman who had never had the luxury of hysteria. But there was something beneath it now, a resonance, as if the trees were speaking with her. My mother was not Ashenmere. She was Thornblood, the last of the old line. The wolves who were bonded to the forest before the packs built their fortresses and forgot. They killed her for it. Ashenmere buried the truth and sold me as tribute, so no one would ever know what I carried. Kale's legs nearly buckled. The Thornblood line. The wolves the old stories called the forest's chosen. The ones who could walk between worlds, who could command root and branch and stone, whose bond with the land was so deep that the land itself would fight for them. They were supposed to be extinct. Every alpha in 6 territories believed it. The curse, he said, and his voice was barely human. Seraphine. The curse on my line. It was laid by a forest witch, a woman of the old blood. Your blood. I know. The Thornwood told me. She stepped closer. 1 step. He felt it in his chest like a hammer strike. Warmth, sudden and violent, blooming behind the wall of ice that had been building for 3 centuries. The curse was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to endure until an Ironmaw Alpha chose a Thornblood mate willingly. Not by force, not by conquest, by choice. Genuine, free, unconditional choice. I chose wrong. The words tore out of him. I had you, and I chose wrong because I was a coward and a fool, and You chose politics. Not cruel, not forgiving either, simply true. You chose the alliance over the bond. You chose the throne over the warmth. Yes. He could not look away from her. The frost was climbing his arms visibly now, his skin turning blue-white at the fingertips, the curse sensing what was happening and fighting to finish what it had started. And I would tear down every alliance, burn every treaty, and break my own crown across my knee if it meant you would let me stand beside you. Not as your king, as the man who failed you and will spend the rest of his life earning back what he destroyed. Pretty words from a man who could not even open my door. He flinched as if she had struck him. Because she was right, and because she was standing 10 paces away, and the curse was killing him, and he had no right to ask for anything, and he was going to ask anyway because his wolf was dying, and his heart was dying, and the only warm thing left in the world was her. I am not asking you to save me, he said. I am asking you to let me choose correctly. Once. Before the ice takes me. Let me say it while I still can. He dropped to his knees, in the mud, in front of the wolves on the battlements, in front of Drustan and Marin, who had followed him down, in front of the forest that watched with 1,000 ancient eyes. The Alpha King of Ironmaw, the most powerful wolf in 6 territories, on his knees in the dirt, before a woman the world had called worthless. I choose you, he said. Not because the curse demands it. Not because my wolf demands it. Because you are the only person in 300 years who looked at me and saw something other than a throne to fear or a weapon to wield. Because you were starving in my own fortress, and you never once begged, and I will never forgive myself for that. Because when you burned my mark off your skin, you were braver than I have ever been in my entire reign. Seraphine looked down at him. The markings on her skin pulsed once, bright, warm, golden. And the thornwood behind her shuddered, branches creaking, leaves whispering in a language that predated every pack and every crown. The forest told me something else, she said quietly. It told me the curse would kill you within the week, that the ice would take your heart first, then your lungs, then your mind, and that by the time the snow covered this fortress, there would be nothing left of you but a frozen throne and a cautionary tale. Then let it. No. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. She closed the distance between them. 5 paces, 3, 1, and knelt in front of him, eye to eye. Her hands found his face, and where her fingers touched his skin, the frost retreated. Not slowly, instantly, like darkness fleeing a lit match. His breath caught. Warmth. Actual, physical, devastating warmth flooded from her palms into his jaw, his cheekbones, spreading down through his neck and into his chest, where it collided with 3 centuries of ice and shattered it. He gasped. The sound was raw and broken and inhuman. The sound of a man surfacing after being held underwater for a lifetime. His hands came up to cover hers, and his fingers were trembling, and his eyes were no longer white or gold, but a deep, startled brown. His real eyes. The eyes beneath the curse. The color no one had seen since before the frost took root. I am not saving you because you asked, Seraphine said. I am saving you because I choose to. And if you ever make me invisible again, I will walk back into that forest and I will not come out. I will follow you in. The thornwood would eat you alive. Then I will die in there trying to reach you, and it will still be better than a single day of the life I was living before you walked into my hall. She kissed him. Not gently, not tentatively. She kissed him like a woman who had survived a forest that devoured wolves, who had burned a king's mark off her own throat with a kitchen knife, who had walked barefoot through a judgment older than civilization and come out the other side wearing a crown the earth itself had given her. She kissed him, and the ice in his chest did not crack. It evaporated, turned to mist, turned to nothing. And in its place, warmth roared through him so violently that his wolf surged to the surface and howled. Not in pain, not in rage, but in something that sounded, for the first time in 300 years, like joy. The frost on the fortress walls began to melt. Water ran down the stone in rivulets, streaming from the battlements, dripping from the eaves, pooling in the courtyard where it reflected the sudden, impossible sunlight breaking through clouds that had been grey since before anyone could remember. Wolves on the walls shifted involuntarily, not in threat but in celebration, their howls joining the chorus until the sound filled the valley and echoed off the mountains and carried into territories that had not heard the Ironmoor sing in centuries. Maren, watching from the gate with tears cutting clean lines through the weathered landscape of her face, whispered to Drustan, "That is the sound this pack was supposed to make." Cale pulled back just far enough to look at her. His face was wet. He had not cried in 300 years because the tears had frozen before they could fall. And now they came freely, cutting warm tracks down his cheeks, and he did not wipe them away. "Your Majesty," Drustan called from behind them, his voice unsteady with something that might have been awe. "The throne room. You should see the throne room." They walked in together, side by side. Not King and Omega, not Alpha and Outcast. Something else. Something the pack had no name for yet. The great hall of Ironmoor had been cold stone and iron for as long as anyone alive could remember. The wolf throne, carved from a single black oak that had once grown in the center of the thornwood, had been deadwood for 3 centuries, its surface perpetually rimed with frost, painful to touch, a seat that punished everyone who sat upon it. It was blooming. Green shoots pushed through the ancient grain. Leaves unfurled along the armrests, small, silver-veined, trembling with new life. At the base of the throne, where frost had cracked the flagstones for generations, a single vine had pushed through and was climbing the carved wolf's leg, and at its tip, a bud was forming. Seraphine touched the armrest. The throne shuddered and then bloomed fully. Every branch, every carved surface erupting with growth until the dead black wood was alive again. A living throne of green and silver, and the air in the hall smelled like rain on warm earth, like pine sap, like the deep heart of a forest that had been waiting 300 years for someone to come home. "Well," Maren said from the doorway, her voice wobbling only slightly, "I suppose that settles the question of who sits on it." 3 months later. The gardens of Ironmore, which had not existed 3 months ago, were in full bloom. Someone, no one could quite remember who, had begun planting in the courtyard the week after the curse shattered, and the seeds had taken to the newly thawed soil with an eagerness that the older wolves called suspicious, and the younger wolves called a miracle. Roses climbed the outer wall. Herbs grew in window boxes. The kitchen garden alone had yielded enough in its first harvest to feed the fortress for a week, and the head cook had wept openly and blamed the onions. Seraphine sat on the living throne. It had become hers in practice before it became hers in ceremony, the wolves of Ironmore deferring to her with a naturalness that surprised everyone except Maren, who claimed she had predicted the entire thing and would appreciate it if everyone would stop acting so shocked. The bonding ceremony had been held at the autumn equinox, in the clearing where the thornwood met the fortress grounds. The forest had attended. That was the only way to describe it. The trees had leaned in, the canopy had opened, and light had poured down on them like a benediction, while every wolf in 6 territories watched the Alpha King mark his Luna with a bite that shimmered gold instead of silver. Kale stood behind the throne, one hand resting on its living back, his fingers tracing the vines that grew new leaves each morning. He was warm. After 3 centuries of cold, he still marveled at it. The heat of the fire on his skin, the warmth of her shoulder against his chest when she leaned back, the simple, staggering miracle of being able to feel.
"A letter arrived," Torsten said, entering with an expression that suggested he had already read it and was enjoying himself immensely. "From the Ashenmere pack." Seraphine took it, read it once. A smile crossed her face, not warm, not cold, but the precise expression of a woman who had once been the lowest creature in a pack that had sold her like livestock, and was now reading their groveling request for trade terms from a throne made of living wood. "The Elder of Ashenmere sends his most humble regards," she said, her voice carrying the faintest edge of something that was not quite mercy, "and wishes to formally recognize the Thornblood line. He also requests, and I am quoting, the honor of renewed diplomatic relations with Ironmore, at Her Majesty's earliest convenience." Kale's mouth twitched. "At your convenience?" "I am extremely inconvenient," Seraphine said. "I may be inconvenient for quite some time. Take as long as you need." She set the letter aside. The vine on the throne curled once around her wrist and settled, like a cat finding a warm lap. Outside, The Thornwood stood green and ancient and patient, at the border of a kingdom it had decided, after 300 years, to forgive. In the distance, a wolf howled, then another, then a dozen, rising together into the autumn sky. Not a warning, not a summons, but a sound the Ironmore pack had forgotten it knew how to make. A song. So, where are you listening from tonight? I would love to hear. Drop it in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, if you gasped or held your breath, or replayed that moment when she kissed him and the ice broke, tell me which scene got you. Share your thoughts. And if you have not already, subscribe so you never miss a story. I will see you in the next one.